Hey everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we are going to be talking about Scrum. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how companies adapt Scrum to their needs. In reality, companies are out there using it. They're making changes as they go. We've got a really cool paper to guide us today. It's called Scrum in Practice, an overview of adaptations. And it's by Michal Hron and Nicholas Obwegieser from Aarhus University.
It's kind of a systematic look at a lot of different studies.
Exactly. And that's what I like about it. It's not just one person's opinion or one company. They've gone through different research and synthesized it into this overview of how Scrum is actually being used.
Right. And I think that's the key takeaway. There's this perception that Scrum is very rigid. You have to do it by the book. But in reality, companies are constantly adapting it to meet their specific needs.
That makes sense. No two companies are exactly the same, so why would we expect them to all use Scrum in exactly the same way? Okay, so let's start with the basics. We're talking about Scrum. Like, popular is Scrum in the first place? Like, I hear about it all the time.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
It's by far the most popular Agile method out there. Over half the companies that are using Agile approaches are using Scrum in some form or another. It is. And, there's some really good reasons for that. It's a relatively simple framework, especially compared to some of the others out there.
Yeah.
And it's also very versatile. It can be adapted to fit a lot of different situations.
So we've established that Scrum is popular, and we've established that it's often used, not exactly as intended. So what's the big takeaway here? Why are companies messing with a good thing?
The research highlights 7 key reasons why companies adapt Scrum. They all boil down to this idea of making Scrum work better in specific situations. 7 reasons.
That's quite a lot. Let's dive into a few of the most impactful ones. What would you say is the tier P reason? Companies feel the need to adapt Scrum.
I'd say the biggest driver right now is the rise of distributed teams.
Okay, distributed teams.
You've got team members who are spread across different locations, sometimes even different continents. And that throws a wrench into some of Scrum's core practices. Try to have a daily stand-up meeting when your team is scattered across multiple time zones.
That's not easy.
It's not as simple as just gathering everyone around a whiteboard anymore.
So how are companies adapting Scrum to bridge the distance?
One common adaptation is using technology to create a virtual space for the team. You're using project management tools that provide a central hub for communication, for task management, for progress tracking, really trying to create that sense of connection, that sense of shared understanding, even when team members are physically separated.
Technology becomes the glue that holds the team together, even when they're miles apart. That's pretty cool. I imagine there are also challenges that come with relying so heavily on technology.
Of course, it's not a perfect solution. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is making sure the communication remains effective.
Right. It's easy to misinterpret things when you're not face-to-face.
Exactly. You miss those nonverbal cues. You miss that immediate feedback. So companies have to be much more deliberate about how they communicate.
Interesting. It's almost like you have to over-communicate in a virtual setting to make up for the lack of in-person interaction.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So we've talked about distributed teams, but you mentioned there were 7 key reasons for adapting Scrum. What's another big one that companies are grappling with?
Well, another common motivation is the need to integrate user experience design or UX design into the Scrum process.
Okay, UX. So how does that fit in?
Traditional Scrum doesn't explicitly address UX.
Right.
And that can lead to some problems down the road.
Yeah, because you can build something that's technically brilliant, but if it's a nightmare to use, nobody's going to use it.
Exactly. Nobody wants to use software that's frustrating or confusing.
Okay, so how are companies adapting Scrum to make sure that the user experience is front and center?
One increasingly popular adaptation is having a dedicated UX Scrum team.
Oh, really? A whole team?
A whole team dedicated to UX. And they work kind of in parallel with the development team, but they usually work a couple of sprints ahead.
Oh, so they're kind of like paving the way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a separate lane on the highway, specifically for UX.
I like that analogy. Are there any downsides to that approach, though? Like, does it ever create bottlenecks or miscommunication between the UX team and the developers?
That's a great question. It's certainly a potential challenge. You've got 2 teams working in parallel. It's really important to make sure that they're communicating effectively, that they're coordinating their effort.
You don't want them to be like ships passing in the night.
Exactly.
So communication and alignment seem to be recurring themes here.
Definitely.
Whether it's bridging the distance between distributed teams,
Mhm.
or making sure that UX and development are in sync?
It's all about making sure that everyone is on the same page, that everyone has a shared understanding of the goals and how they're going to achieve those goals.
This is all incredibly insightful. I'm already starting to see how these adaptations play out in the real world. We've covered 2 of the 7 key reasons for adapting Scrum, but what about the other 5?
The remaining reasons revolve around things like combining Scrum with other methodologies, aligning Scrum with larger company strategy, using tools to enhance Scrum's effectiveness.
It sounds like companies are really getting creative with how they're using Scrum. So how are they actually making these changes? What specific modifications are they making to the framework?
The researchers identified 6 main ways that companies adapt Scrum. And it's interesting to see that there are different levels of modification. Some companies just make small tweaks. They add a few elements here and there from other methodologies,
Right.
whereas other companies, they go all in. They
Right.
create entirely new roles or artifacts.
So it's not just like black and white, either you're doing Scrum or you're not.
It's definitely a spectrum. One adaptation is called combination. That's where you're blending parts of Scrum
Mm.
with parts of other systems. So you might see a company using Scrum
Yeah.
for its iterative development cycles,
Yeah.
but they might incorporate something like CMMI Level 2. CMMI stands for Capability Maturity Model Integration. It's a framework that helps organizations improve their processes, particularly in software development. It's often seen as a more traditional, more structured approach.
So kind of the opposite of Agile.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. But some companies find that CMMI actually provides a level of rigor and process maturity that can complement Scrum's iterative nature.
So it's like adding some structure
Yeah.
to the free-flowing nature of Scrum.
Exactly.
I can see how that might be appealing to some companies,
Yeah.
especially those that are used to more traditional development methods.
Exactly. It could be a good way to bridge that gap.
So combination, that's one adaptation. What else you got? What other ways are companies modifying the nuts and bolts of Scrum?
Another interesting one is what they call pre-development. And this involves adding extra planning steps before the usual Scrum sprints begin.
So before you even start sprinting,
Exactly.
you're doing some extra planning.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's like laying the groundwork, getting everyone on the same page before you actually start building.
So it's like taking a moment to sharpen your tools before you start chopping wood. You'll end up with a better product in the end.
Exactly. Can be particularly beneficial when you're dealing with complex projects or when there's a high degree of uncertainty.
Right, because if you don't know what you're building, it's hard to just jump in and start sprinting.
You need to take some time to figure things out.
So we've got combination, we've got pre-development.
Yeah.
What's another way companies are adapting Scrum?
Well, there's one called
Guidance.
guidance.
Okay.
And this is essentially about providing advice or best practices for using Scrum in a specific way.
So it's like having a Scrum coach in your back pocket,
Exactly.
reminding you to stay focused on the customer, embrace change, keep things simple.
It's about making sure that those principles
Mhm.
are actually being applied in practice.
It's not just about reading the Scrum guide. It's about actually understanding how to apply those principles
Yeah.
in a real-world setting. Guidance can be particularly useful when teams are new to Scrum or
Yeah.
when they're struggling to apply those principles effectively.
That's like having
Training wheels for your Scrum journey. We've got a good understanding now of the why behind Scrum adaptations and the different approaches that companies are taking, but I want to talk about the real-world impact of these changes. What are some specific examples of adaptations that are actually working?
one example that really illustrates the power of Scrum adaptations is how companies are managing
Global Scrum tool.
global Scrum teams.
That sounds intense.
It is. You know, we touched on the challenges of distributed teams earlier.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about teams that are spread across multiple continents,
Right.
the complexity just goes up exponentially.
So how are companies making it work?
Well, one solution that's proving to be really effective
Mm-hmm.
is maintaining a shared platform and backlog
Okay.
that all the teams can access, regardless of location.
Okay, so everyone's working from the same source of truth.
Exactly. It's like having a virtual command center where everyone can see the big picture, even if they're physically miles apart.
That's a great analogy. But I imagine there are also cultural differences to navigate
Oh, absolutely.
when you're working with global teams.
Cultural sensitivity is essential.
Okay,
When you're managing global Scrum teams,
right.
companies are finding that it's important to be mindful of.
Mm-hmm.
Different communication styles,
Okay.
different time zones,
Right.
even different holidays.
Yeah.
It's considered appropriate behavior
Yeah.
in one culture
Mm-hmm.
might be completely different in another culture.
So you have to be very aware of those differences.
Absolutely. It's all about building trust and understanding across cultures.
And I imagine that takes time and effort.
It does.
It's not something you can just snap your fingers and...
It's a process.
Yeah.
It requires conscious effort and a willingness to learn from each other.
This is fascinating stuff. I'm already starting to think about how I might apply some of these insights to my own work. We were talking about specific examples, though, of successful Scrum adaptations. What else caught your eye in the research?
Well, another area where we're seeing some really innovative adaptations is in the integration of UX design into Scrum.
Oh, right. We talked about that earlier. Having a dedicated UX Scrum team working a few sprints ahead of the developers. Are there any specific examples of how that's actually playing out?
There's this methodology called U-Scrum that's gaining some traction. And it basically adds specialized UX roles and artifacts to the traditional Scrum framework. And the whole idea is to ensure that the user is at the heart of the development process from start to finish.
So it's not just about having a UX team off in their own little silo. It's about integrating them into the Scrum process.
Exactly. It's about breaking down those silos and fostering collaboration between the UX designers, the developers, and the product owner.
I'm sensing a theme here. Breaking down silos, fostering collaboration, creating a shared understanding. It seems like these are essential ingredients for successful Scrum adaptations, no matter what specific approach you're taking.
You're absolutely right. It's about creating a culture of collaboration and shared ownership, where everyone feels empowered to contribute their unique skills and perspectives.
This has been incredibly insightful. But I'm curious, are there any Scrum adaptations that you've seen fail? What are some of the pitfalls that companies should be aware of?
Yeah, that's a great question. Adapting Scrum isn't a magic bullet.
Right.
It's not a guarantee of success.
Right.
There are definitely pitfalls to avoid.
Okay.
One common mistake I see is companies trying to force fit Scrum into a situation where it's just not appropriate.
So it's not one size fits all. Okay.
Scrum is a powerful framework, but it's not suitable for every situation. It's important to carefully consider your context, your team's skills and experience, the nature of the project, before you decide whether to adapt them, and if so, how to adapt it.
So you shouldn't just jump on the Scrum bandwagon. You have to think about whether it's actually the right fit for your specific situation.
Exactly.
Companies should be aware of.
Another common mistake, overcomplicating things. It's easy to get caught up in all the cool Scrum adaptations out there and end up with a process that's so complex and burdensome that it defeats the purpose of using Scrum in the first place.
You lose that elegance and simplicity. That makes Scrum so appealing.
Exactly. But finding that sweet spot between customization and clarity.
Okay, so we've talked about the why behind Scrum adaptations, the how, and some specific examples of both successful and unsuccessful implementations. But let's step back and talk about the bigger picture. What are the key takeaways here? What are the most important things to remember when adapting Scrum?
The first and most important takeaway is that adapting Scrum is essential. If you want to make it work in diverse situations, but you've got to do it carefully.
Right.
Too much change and you risk losing the core benefits of Scrum in the first place. You need to be intentional about the changes you make.
Right.
You need to understand how those changes are going to impact your process and your team.
It's about understanding the why behind Scrum, the principles that make it effective, and then using that knowledge to guide your adaptation. What else should companies keep in mind?
Another crucial consideration is the need for ongoing evaluation. Just because you've implemented a Scrum adaptation doesn't mean it's set in stone. You need to constantly monitor its effectiveness, gather feedback from the team, and be willing to make adjustments as needed.
So it's an iterative process, just like Scrum itself. You're constantly tweaking and refining.
Continuous improvement.
Continuous improvement. This is all so valuable. I can see how these insights can help teams avoid common pitfalls and make more informed decisions about how to adapt Scrum. A lot of what we've been discussing is based on real-world experiences, case studies from companies that have actually implemented these adaptations. What about the academic side of things? Is there a lot of formal research on Scrum adaptations?
Most of the information we have about Scrum adaptations comes from practitioners, people who are actually out there using Scrum in the real world.
Right.
There's a real lack of rigorous academic research on this topic, given how widespread Scrum is. The academic world hasn't quite caught up with the realities of how Scrum is being used and adapted.
So we've got all these fascinating stories, anecdotal evidence, but not a lot of hard data to back it up.
That's right.
That seems like a missed opportunity.
We need more structured comparative studies that really dig into what makes certain Scrum adaptations successful. While others fail,
Right.
we need to move beyond those individual success stories and start building a more robust body of knowledge.
So it sounds like there's a real need for more research in this area.
Absolutely.
More data, more analysis, more insights that can help companies make informed decisions.
Exactly. And that research needs to go beyond simply describing what companies are doing. It needs to explore the why behind those adaptations, the challenges they faced, the outcomes they achieved,
It's about understanding the cause and effect, the nuance.
the trade-offs. It's about moving from anecdotal evidence to a more scientific understanding of Scrum adaptations.
And how do we get there?
That's where the academic world can really contribute. By bringing a more rigorous research approach to this field, we can start to uncover those underlying principles
Okay.
that make certain Scrum adaptations effective
Right.
and identify the factors that contribute to success or failure.
That would give companies a more solid foundation for making decisions about how to adapt Scrum.
It would help them avoid common pitfalls, increase their chances of success.
It would take some of the guesswork out of it.
Exactly.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on Scrum. It's not just this rigid framework. It's like a living, breathing system
Okay.
that can be adapted and molded.
Very dynamic.
Yeah, to fit the unique needs of different teams and organizations.
That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
It's a framework that encourages experimentation and continuous improvement.
Right.
It empowers teams to take ownership of their process and find what works best for them.
You know, you're right. It's not about finding that perfect Scrum adaptation. It's
Yeah.
about embracing that journey of continuous learning and refinement.
It's about being agile, not just in our development processes, but in our mindset as well, that agile mindset.
Okay, well, on that note, dear listeners, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Scrum adaptations. Before we sign off, we want to leave you with a thought-provoking question.
We've given you a lot to chew on today, but the real learning happens when you apply these insights to your own situation.
So here's the challenge. If you were to adapt Scrum for your own needs, what aspect would you change first and why?
What pain point are you trying to solve? What would make Scrum work better for your team, your project, your organization?
Maybe you're struggling to integrate UX design. Maybe you're trying to figure out how to manage a distributed team. Or maybe you're simply looking for ways to inject more flexibility into your Scrum process.
Whatever your situation,
Yeah.
we encourage you to take some time to reflect on this question, jot down your thoughts, brainstorm with your team, see what innovative solutions you can come up with.
And remember, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's all about finding what makes sense for you, your team, and your organization. So go forth and adapt, dear listeners. And as always, keep that thirst for knowledge flowing. Until next time, happy Scrumming.